So what we are going to discuss today is called the AWS Global Infrastructure. This is where AWS have their data centers located. So as a customer or as an AWS customer, if you want to use or host any of your resources or your services, resources with AWS or services with AWS, then you have to be mindful of which data center you are putting your resources, because there are a lot of things that comes with how you select a particular data center or how you select a particular AWS global infrastructure or AWS data center that you want to use. So we are going to discuss those things that you must put into consideration before you pick a particular data center. If your customers are in, let's say, in Africa, then you have to pick a server or a data center that is close to them, so that by the time they are accessing your application, it's not going to be too slow. If your customer, if the majority of them are in maybe in Asia, then you have to pick a data center that is closer to them, maybe a data center in Asia. But there are times that you cannot, you might want to pick a data center that is closer to your customer, but there are some challenges that might happen that you won't be able to do so, and we are going to discuss that later. But before we go deeply into the introduction, to discuss, let's look at what we are going to cover today. So the AWS Global Infrastructure Overview is going to be our first topic, which I will be explaining to you. Then followed by that, we're going to look at the elements of AWS Global Infrastructure. What are those elements that you must consider when you are picking a data that you must familiarize yourself with in AWS Global Infrastructure? Then how do you, going to understand the use of what we call an AWS region. We're going to understand availability zone. We're going to understand the local zone and edge network location. These four: AWS region, availability zone, local zone, and edge location, they are very, very important if you want to pick a particular data center where you're going to put your resources. Then we're going to also do knowledge check if there is some time, and after that we are going to start interacting with our AWS. For the past 3 classes, we have not have anything to do with AWS account, but after this this section, we will start interacting, having some hands-on on our AWS account, and that is why I asked you to make sure that you open your AWS account before today. So there are multiple ways of accessing or interacting with your AWS. So we are going to discuss all of them, and we are going to go to the AWS console, which is the graphical user interface, and try to arrange our environment so that it can be easy to identify things. So what are the objectives? The first objective is you're going to understand the AWS global infrastructure, which is very, very important. Then you will understand the roles of AWS region and availability zone. You understand the purpose and benefits of AWS local zone. You will learn about AWS edge location, AWS edge network location, and their impact on network performance. Then finally, you're going to gain insights into how to interact effectively with AWS services within the infrastructure. So these are your objectives. At the end of this class, just go back and ask yourself, do I understand the AWS global infrastructure? Do I understand or know the importance and the definition of AWS region and availability zone? Do I understand what a region is? Do I understand how to use edge location, network edge network location? Do I understand how to use local zone? All of this should be what you ask yourself at the end of the section, possibly when you are studying by yourself. All right, the first two topics, AWS Global Infrastructure Overview and Elements of Global Infrastructure. As I said earlier, all cloud providers, they have multiple data centers. So they need a way to be able to identify a particular data center so that when any of their customers want to use a particular data center, it can be easily communicated within each other. Like, oh, I want to use one of your data center in Asia. Then I will be, if I'm the cloud provider, I will ask, okay, which data center? Then you start describing it. So for this not to happen, AWS have a lot of data center and they categorize it by continent. They have data centers in Africa, they have data centers in Europe, they have data centers in Asia, they have data centers in different places in America, in North America, and they also have in Canada. And there are some countries, specifically, some continents that have more data centers. So if, let's say in US now, they cannot just categorize all the data centers in US as just one. So there are some data centers that are closer to each other, while some are far away from each other, though all of them are still in the US. So what AWS do is that they categorize, they have like all the data centers that are closer within like some states or within a state. So at the top of the level of their categorization, they have what we call the region. So if you are using a particular data center, this is the first thing that you must be able to identify, like, okay, which region do I want to deploy my resources? Are you deploying your resources in US? Are you deploying it in Asia or Europe? Or are you deploying it in Africa? And there are other places like that. So if you are deploying in US, then you have to pick which of the data center. So because there are multiple data centers within a geographical zone in AWS. So in US, they have multiple regions. So it's not just like US is one region. So in US, they have multiple regions. But how do they classify this region? That is why they have something like US. If the data center you want to use is in east side, then they say what we call US East 1. So in US East, they have two data centers. So that is why they call it US East 1 and 2. We have US East 1 and US East 2. And the same thing in Europe. In Europe, because Europe is large, they have a lot of data centers in Europe. You have Europe, I think they call it Europe East 1, Europe East 2, but I don't use any of the data center in Europe. So let's go back here. So we have the US East 1. The US East 1 is North Virginia. And we have US East 2, which is California. So when we get to the AWS account, let me even log into the AWS account and just show you that side. Don't worry if you have not used AWS account before, we will still get there. But I just need to connect to my AWS account. I just need to connect to my AWS account and show you, okay, where do you select this region from? So if you are seeing my AWS account here, if you look at this angle here. Can you guys see? I'm talking about here.
Yes.
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah.
North Virginia.
Yeah, North Virginia. So what this is just saying is that currently the region I'm using is North Virginia. So anything I'm doing on this AWS account is in their North Virginia data center, one of the North Virginia data center. That is what I'm using. So if I want to use another one, I will just click on the drop down arrow and I can pick anyone from this. You can see in US, they have four regions. US is one, US is two, US West 1, and US West 2. So the US East 1 is in North Virginia, the 2 is in Ohio, the 3 is in North California, then we have Oregon. So these are the one in US. In Asia, we have multiple in Asia. We have AP South 1, AP North 3, AP North 2, AP South 1, AP South 2, AP North 1. So all of these are in Asia. So if your customer base is majorly in Asia, then this is one of the region that you should be working on. So let's say I have customers in Europe. All I just need to do is to pick one of these and just click, and immediately it's going to change my location, my region to Europe. So what that simply means, anything I'm deploying on this AWS interface is in their data center in Europe, in one of the data center in Europe. So let's go back to this. So the data center spread across or around globe. So it's not all that because AWS is in US, all their data center is in US. No. So what are the elements of AWS global infrastructure? We have seen one of them called region. Then another element that is important is the availability zone, followed by the local zone and edge location. So these are the four elements of AWS that we are going to be looking at. There is other one called wavelength, but we are not going to look at that in this, but I will just talk about it briefly. So let's look at region in detail, which I've already explained earlier. So each region is in a specific geographical location, and each geographical location has a cluster of data center, at least 3. So what does this mean? If you pick AWS US East 1, that is the region that you want to use. So in this region, there are at least 3 data centers inside this single region. So if you are using this region, there is tendency that you are using either this or this or this. You are using one of the 3. And it can be more than 3. You can have up to 9 or 10. It's more than 1 or 2, at least 3. So let's say if you have let's say we have 12 regions. Let's say we have, let me say, I'm just going to make this small. Let's say we have 20 20 data center in this region alone. Let's say we have 20 data centers in this region alone. I'm just going to draw the remaining big to save our time. So let's say these are the data centers. Each one of them is data center in US East 1. So just let's leave that one for now. I'm going to come back to it. So currently, there are 34 launched regions across the globe. there are more that are coming because they are going to have a region in Mexico. I think they want to have in UK. And so there are more regions coming, but currently there are 34 regions running currently. And this is how the region also look like. This ones I draw out here. And so you can select any of this region, any region. You can select a region in US East 1, US East 2, just as we selected region the other time. When you are dealing with region, if you pick any region, let's say there are these 24 regions in 24 data centers in this region. If you go to your AWS and change region here to Ohio, let's say we are dealing with Ohio. If you pick any of this region, are you getting me? You are using one of these data center. Anything you deploy, we go to one of these data center. But there are times that you actually want to narrow down to a particular or a set of data center. So if you just pick US East 1 and your data just go to any one, your data might be going to a very far data center that is not even closer to your customer. So there are multiple means of like selecting a data center that are kind of closer to each other. So let's say I want to deploy my resources, but because of natural disaster, I want to make sure that I deploy my resources in multiple data centers. The same resources, I want to deploy it to multiple data centers so that if one data center go down, because it can, this is what we are talking here is natural disaster. It can happen to anybody, no matter how big your company is. So if there is a flood, and if your resources are deployed in this data center, and if there is flood there, that means all your data are gone. So you want to deploy your data into multiple data centers. So you might deploy one here, deploy one here, and deploy one here, so that your resources will still be available even after the data center. And because AWS will not actually tell you which data center are you deploying your resources in, they will just, if you just pick that you want to deploy to 3, they will just pick 3 randomly. So in order for your resources not to be deployed far away from each other, so that you won't deploy one here, another one will go here, another one will go here. So in order for this not to happen, AWS do what we call, they categorize these data centers that are closer to each other as an availability zone. So there are some data centers that are closer to each other. They name those group of data center availability zone. So if you are picking a particular data center, then, so if you deploy this one resources here, because these 3 data centers are closer to each other, then the natural disaster that we discussed earlier might actually affect the 3 of them. So they want a situation whereby your resources will be highly available. So if you deploy one here, you might pick another availability zone, because here is one availability zone. This is 2, this is 3, this is 4 here. So you can deploy one resources here, then another one here. So the natural disaster, even if it happens here, because these are closer to each other, then if your resources go down, then this will still be available because they are not that close to each other. So if natural disaster happens here, there is tendency that it will not happen here. So your resources can still continue to run here. And if it happens here, there is tendency that it's not going to affect this. So our next topic now is the availability zone. So when we talk about availability zone, the number one importance of availability zone is to make sure that your resources is highly available. That is the number one thing and the major thing. So if anybody is asking you question about the purpose of availability zone, is just to make sure that your resources is highly available. So an availability zone is a single data center or a group of data center. If you go back to our drawing the other time, before I clean it up, you will see that inside what I call a region, we have multiple data centers, and the data centers that are closer to each other are called an availability zone. So inside your availability zone, there is at least more than one data center inside an availability zone. You have at least 2 or 3 data center inside a single availability zone. So if one data center go down inside that same availability zone, you have another one running. So in your availability zone, so let's go back to here. An availability zone is a single data center or a group of data centers within a region. If a disaster occurs in one part of the region, the geographical distance helps to ensure that not all the availability zones are affected. So when you have availability zone, they are kind of the group of availability zone. They are a little bit far away from each other. So we might have this one as AZ1, AZ2. So both AZ1 and AZ2 are in the same region. But AZ1 is kind of far, a little bit far away, like 60 miles away from AZ2. So if there is flood in AZ1 and it affects all the data center in AZ1, it's not going to affect AZ2. So when you are deploying your resources and you want the resources to be highly available simply means you want the resources to be running every time. So you're going to deploy one resources here and you're going to deploy one here. So if anything happens to this availability zone, then rest assured that your resources can be served from here. So that is why your availability zone, its major purpose is to make sure that you have an highly available resources. So what are the main characteristics of availability zone? It contains one or more data centers. Inside each AWS region, you can find at least 2 availability zones. So inside a single region, you can find at least 2 availability zones. All AZ in an availability zone are interconnected. So what does this mean? If you have, let's say this is our region, and inside this region, we have multiple availability zones, at least 2 of them. Let's say we have 3. And inside this AZ, this is region, this is AZ. This is the 3, AZ2, and AZ1. So here we have data centers, right? And they are not equal. Some data center might be more in a specific availability zone. But what we are discussing here is that each of these availability zones, they are connected, although they are far away, not too far, like 60 miles away from each other. But guess what? They are connected. They are connected to each other. So if you have, or if you want your resources, if you deploy your resources in one availability zone, if you want to connect to that same resources from a separate or the second availability zone, it's possible because they are connected by default. They are connected to each other. But regions are separated. So this is, let's say this is US East 1, and this is US East 2 as region. US East 2. These two regions, they are not connected to each other. They are isolated. They are isolated. So if you want resources from here to be able to communicate to resources from here, there are a lot of things that you have to do. You have to configure it yourself. Not by default, they are not talking to each other. They are standalone. But here, by default, they are connected to each other. So you don't need to do any configuration for these two, for resources here to be able to communicate to resources here. But here, for the region, yeah, you have to do a lot of configuration or some configuration. So availability zones are interconnected. I hope that is clear.
Yes.
All traffic between AZ is encrypted or are encrypted. So what that simply means, remember we say they are interconnected. You have AZ1 that is connected to AZ2. When you are sending traffic, I taught you what traffic means last week. Like you are sending a message. So if you are sending traffic from AZ1 to AZ2, maybe your server is here and your database is here. So when you collect information from your customer, from your website that is running on this server in AZ1, you are saving it in a server that is in AZ2. This message that you are sending, because it has to pass through the internet, at least basic, it has to pass through the internet for the message to be able to deliver here. So while it's going through the internet, anything might happen along the way. We might have what we call a bad guys, those bad guys, you know them, the hackers or the middleman. We call them middleman attacks. So we might have all these middlemen that are listening to that message that you are sending. So they might hijack the message along the line. So in order for you to protect this message that is going, we need to make sure that even if they hijack or interfere with the message, they will not be able to read it. So we're going to turn normal text like I need. Okay, we are going to turn normal text like username is equal to admin and password is equal to password 1, 2, 3. So if you are connecting from your server to your database, you will need to send username and your password of this database so that by the time the message comes, it will be able to save. So because you are sending your username and password and you send it in plain text like this that anybody can read it, then this middleman, when they stop the message, they will be able to know your password and your username. So in order for this not to happen, when you are sending message, we are going to turn this user and the password into something that they cannot understand. We might turn this username, we might leave it the way it is, or we might turn it into like gibberish like this, 1, 2, AF, column 1, 2. We just turn it into gibberish that they cannot read. And this password we also turned out into gibberish like $1, this $sign 1.012K01F. So we turned it into this. So by the time they even get, if they have access to it, they stop this, they will still not be able to understand what this gibberish means. But by the time the message gets to where it is going, then we can convert it back to its original form. So this process of changing a plain text into a ciphertext, we call this ciphertext. The process of changing a plain text into a ciphertext is called encryption. And by the time you are changing the gibberish back to the normal text, we call it decryption. So encryption and decryption is something that you should go and read. It's in cybersecurity. So the message that goes from here to here is encrypted so that they cannot be interfered. And all AZ are physically separated by meaningful distance, usually within 60 miles. They are separated, but it's meaningful because 60 miles is not that far compared to thousands of miles, which at times region or hundreds of miles, which region are used to separated from each other. But AZ, they are separated enough that a natural disaster in one availability zone will not affect the other availability zone. And low latency networking, redundant power, and connectivity. You know, when things are closer to each other, they tend to communicate faster with each other. So here is a diagram of showing you availability zone and region. So you can see inside a region, we have multiple availability zone. And you can select any of the availability zone of your choice. If you are deploying resources, you select an availability zone. When you select an availability zone, you can only know the availability zone that you select, but the data center that your resources is going to be deployed in, you will not know. AWS will pick one randomly. Remember, inside an availability zone, there are multiple data centers. So AWS will just pick one for you, but you can select which of the availability zone you want. So this is just a mere relationship between data center, availability zone, and region. You have at the top your region, then your region is separated into different availability zone, and each availability zone comprises of multiple regions. So let's look at how the AWS region and availability zone are named, their naming convention. At the top is the region, and the region is written like this. I explained this earlier. US for US location, East for the sub area, and one depending of how many regions they have in that location. So if they have three, you might see something like 1, 2, 3. Example of them are the region in the Europe or Asia. But in US, you have 2 regions in East. So we have US East 1 and US East 2. You have 2 regions in West. You have US West 1 and US West 2. So inside this region, there are availability zones. So if there are multiple, let's say there are 3 availability zones in a region, then it's going to see something like US East 1A, US East 1A, US East 1B, or US East 1C, because there are 3 availability zones. If there are more than 3, you will see A, B, C, D, and continue like that. I think the highest is 6, A, B, C, D, E, F. So this is, and it is area for the US, sub area for the East, number of region, and then followed by the availability zone. So that's why you have US East 1, US East 2, US West 1, US West 2, and things like that. If you go back here and let's quickly look at this. If you look at those ones that are the Asia, you have AP South 1, AP Southeast 1, AP South East 2, okay, and we have AP North 3. This one has 3, AP North 1, AP North 2, and AP North 3. So that means they have 3 regions within that area. Any questions so far? All right.
No.
All right. So you can see here, this is the breakdown of region name, region identifier, region name, region identifier. You don't really need to know this region name. You can always go to your AWS account to check it up. If you are communicating on the job, you will not be saying US East, US East Ohio, or US East North Virginia, or US West Oregon. What you will be using is this identifier: US East 1, US East 2, US West 1, US West 2, AF South 1, AF South 2, EU West 1. This is identifier you're going to be using. And if you are also trying to deploy anything in AWS and they want you to specify which region are you or will you deploy it to, this is what they are asking for. You don't go and be using this. They will not see, they won't understand this. This is what you're going to be using. So I said earlier that there are some factors that you must consider before you pick a region. You don't just say, hey, I like USA, then you pick all USA. There are a lot of factors that you must consider. And the first one of them is the availability of that service that you want to use. Not all regions have all the services that AWS provide. If AWS creates if they make available a particular new service today, that service will only be available in US East 1. If they make available a new service, maybe they develop a new service today, it's only going to be here for the meantime. So this US East 1 is what we refer to as the default region. So in some cases, if you do not specify any region, your resources will be automatically deployed here. So if that region, let's say you want to deploy a service now, all your customers are in Africa, and you want to deploy a service, and you want to pick a region. I think AWS only have region in South Africa. So you want to pick a region in Africa, and you pick this. There is tendency that one of the service that you want to use for your application is not available in South Africa. So you have to refer back to a service or a region that has that service. So the first thing you must consider is that, okay, this application that I want to deploy, what are the services I need? Are there all those services in South African region? If there is, good, you can use it, but also there are also other things to consider. But if there is not all the service, then you have to go to a region that has all the services that you want to use. Then followed by that is the proximity to your customer. How close is that region to your customer? If all your customers are in Europe, then why should you be deploying your resources in US? You want to deploy it in Europe so that your services can be closer to your customer, so that by the time they are accessing your service, what we call latencies can be slow. The lower your latency, the better. Latencies is if you call somebody and that person take like 5 minutes to answer you, that means it's a high latency. But if I called you and you answer me immediately, that is a low latency, and that is the good one. So that is why when you go to some websites, if you are trying to load or open a page, it will just keep rolling for some hours. There are possibility that that service is far away. It's been deployed far away, or maybe other things happen to the website, but most of the time, the services is far away or it's low. So we still understand latencies later. When we talk about latency, we talk about redundance, we talk about what's this called? We talk about the latencies, redundance, scale up, scale down, scale out, all those terminologies, you need to familiarize yourself with them. Also, compliance with data governance and legal requirements. If you are dealing with customers' data, there are a lot of requirements, a lot of legal requirements, compliance that you must comply with. If you are dealing with customers' credit card, maybe you have a business, like you have a store, like you say something, and you are collecting people's credit card, they pay you with credit card. You are dealing with customers' data. So you are expected to be compliant with PCI DSS. If you work in an hospital, maybe you have a business that deals with healthcare, you are expected to be compliant with HIPAA. So there are a lot of policy. If you deal with European citizen, maybe you collect European citizen information, they buy from you, you keep their information, you are expected to comply with GDPR. So there are a lot of policy, and you have to consider those policy or compliance before you pick a region that you want to deploy your resources. If you are dealing with European citizens, then you might be considering choosing a region in Europe in order to avoid a lot of headache. Then finally, the money. Not all regions are priced equally. Some regions are cheap, some are expensive. I believe the far away your region, the more expensive it is. Like if you are using US East 1, that is the cheapest region compared to if you go and be using South Africa. You'll be surprised it's more expensive in Europe. All those ones are more be expensive than. I can cross-check this, but this is the cheapest one. So how differ the prices, I'm not sure, but you have to consider the price. So always for the men for this training period, stick with US East 1. So the other topic that I surely do not want to cover before is local zone and wavelength. When we talk about local zone, this is just an extension of a region. It's an extension of a region, and this is how it's different from a region. Inside a region, you have multiple availability zones. So there are tendency that all these availability zones, they are not still closer, although all of them can be in North Virginia or US East 1. But remember, this is North Virginia, right? All of them, all the availability zone in North Virginia, they might still not as close to your customer as you want it. They might be in a section whereby, for example, California is a very big state, right? And also, not all states in US have region. So what about those other states that they don't have? Then what AWS do is that they created an extension of a region. It's just a region. You still have to pick maybe US East 1 or US East 2. So they now extend this and they now make available some of their services here. They don't have availability zone. It's just a local zone. It's just an availability zone, but in a separate location. So it's just an extension of a region. So they call it local zone. So if you want to deploy your resources, let's say you pick North Virginia, I don't know how close they are, I'm not a geographical person. I don't know how close they are. So if you, let's say you pick North Virginia and your customer base is actually in Texas, so you might want to like use a local zone that extend this region, because local zones are actually created in a highly populated area. So let's say there is a local zone in Texas, which is an extension of North Virginia, then you might want to use that instead of using the availability zone that are available here. So when you are using local zone, the first thing you want to do is to create a subnet. But don't bother, we're going to talk about subnet before later. But just you can use a local zone. But this is not really common. It's a rare occasion that you will see somebody going out of an availability zone and creating a local zone. I've been working in the industry for the past 4 years now. I've not have anything to do with local zone. Anything we want to create, we just pick an availability zone, which is highly faster. But you might have a use case that might warrant you to use a local zone. Maybe you are dealing with all these companies that deal with game. You know how fast game has to be in order to make it make sense. So you can't be playing game and it's kind of slow or skipping, then you will go out of business. So company, when they deal with information that has to do with real-time data, then you have to consider the latencies. And all these are actually because of latencies. Companies want their application to be extremely fast, and that is why they will be thinking of deploying resources in a local zone. So each local zone is just an extension of an availability zone. And one thing about local zone is that in a region, we have availability zone, and all these availability zone, all of them have all the resources. If a resources is in US is 1, availability zone 1A, it will be in the same US is 2 availability zone 1B and availability zone 1C. But local zone might not have all the resources of availability zone. It might just have the main core resources like compute, storage, data center, and other selected AWS service. But if you go to an availability zone, which is inside a region, let's say you have 100 services there. For local zone, you might not have more than 20 because it's just an extension. So that is also another thing that you need to consider before you use local zone. The other one, last one, the wavelength. The wavelength is normally for networking. Maybe your organization is a telecommunication company, and you know how all these telecommunication work, that they have to put a mass that is closer to a particular people. So if your application is in telecommunication line, you might have to tell AWS, or maybe if a telecommunication company wants to use AWS services to enhance their networking requirement, they might have to tell AWS to come and put some of their resources in their data center, in the telecommunication data center. So AWS has partnered with all these telecommunication data center that they have some resources there. If you are having anything to do with mobile phone, all these things, maybe your application works on mobile phone, then you might want to consider deploying your resources in a wavelength. A wavelength zone is just like, let's say we have on T-Mobile. So there are some services that AWS has partnered with T-Mobile. They will just deploy the service in T-Mobile data center. So if you want to use AWS and you want your service to be extremely fast, so instead of going and use region or local zone, instead of using availability zone or local zone, you might want to consider wavelength zone because you are dealing with mobile application. And these are the applications that need single-digit milliseconds latencies. That immediately, just like you are receiving a call now, immediately this person is talking, you want to be hearing it immediately. And somebody, at times when somebody talk, you are hearing their conversation after 2 seconds or after 4 seconds. The latency is there. There is issue with the latencies. So you want somebody speak immediately, you want to hear it immediately. So that is why single-digit latency is very, very important. All right, these are the major elements of the AWS global infrastructure. Any questions so far? No? Let's look at the last one, then we go on break, then when we come back, we go to the second section. Please, those of you that always come late to class, the class starts 9 o'clock. From next class, I will start exactly 9 o'clock for Saturday, and for Sunday, the class starts 4 o'clock, and I'm starting exactly 4 o'clock. And for Wednesday, the class starts 8 o'clock p.m. 7 o'clock p.m. and I'm starting exactly 7. So because for the past 3 days, we've waited like 10 minutes, even at times 11, 12 minutes for people to start joining. All right, the last one is edge location. So we have region, availability zone, local zone, wavelength, and we have edge location. This edge location is actually just a location that you can actually keep your content so that people can access it very fast. This is actually days with content. So when we talk about, let's say, for example, for those of you that used to watch movie, this is what happens if you are watching movie. Let's say you are in Africa. This is you in your house in Africa. And you want to watch Netflix. Netflix. I'm struggling writing these days. Netflix. I hope that is correct. Netflix is actually deployed in US. Let's say Netflix is deployed in US East 1. So a customer in Africa, if you want to watch Netflix, that means you are pulling the data from where the video is stored from here. You are pulling the data from US and you are in Africa. And let's say also another person in Asia, which is far away from Africa, also want to watch Netflix. It too is going to be pulling the data from here. So the latency, let's say this person latency is like 1 second. And this person might be like 0, or let's call this one like 2 seconds, and this one like 1 second. You might think that this is still fast, but in reality, it's slow. So if you are watching Netflix from here directly, your movie will extremely be slow. So in order for this not to happen, this is what companies do. AWS has created like a small location here that when this person wants to watch the Netflix, the communication will not go directly to this place. It will first come here because this is edge location. It will first come here. You will see that is there the Netflix content that I want to watch. Let's say you want to watch, what is this movie? I'm not a movie person. Let's say somebody give me one movie that is current. Ep. Anybody?
A new movie.
What?
I don't. I'm thinking.
Nobody used to watch movie in this class.
What new movie did they have? Um,
The Union.
Reunion. Yeah.
Reunion. Okay.
So let's assume that there's a reunion and somebody in Africa want to watch it. This communication, we first check here. Is there reunion in this edge location? If there is, the internet will pull it from here. So now you can see that the latency is now 0.5 seconds instead of 1, like half. So it's still going to be extremely fast. It's still going to be faster than pulling the data from here, because if you are pulling from here, you're going to be streaming back. So that is why at times when you are watching movie, it's kind of pausing, buffing. So all those things, that is what is responsible for that. So if the video has already been cached, it will watch it, the message will be coming from here, the request and the response will be coming from here. But if the movie, nobody in Africa has watched that movie before, then the message, reunion, I don't want to clean this one. Let me clean this. So if nobody in Africa has actually watched that reunion before, it's not going to be here. It's not going to be cached. So immediately this first person watched that movie from here, though it might be slow, then what is going to happen? The AWS service, there's the AWS service that we are going to discuss later, is called CloudFront. It's going to say, oh, this person is pulling this message, this video from Africa. Okay, it's going to store the movie is going to be cached here, reunion, because somebody in Africa has actually requested for it. So initially, the movie will be watched from here. This person will watch the movie directly from here. So subsequent one, any other person that want to watch the movie from Africa will not be watching from here again, because somebody from Africa has already watched the movie and the movie was pulled from the US. Because somebody has watched it, then they are going to cache the movie here that, okay, actually there is a request from Africa. So we're going to cache this content closer to Africa, because now we believe that there is market in Africa. So they are going to cache that message or that video in what is called an edge location. So, excuse me. So once they cache the message in edge location, anybody that want to watch the movie again, either this initial person or a new person or another person, as long as they are closer to this is where they will be content. This is where the content will be coming from. It's not going to call from here again. So this process is what we call caching. They cached the content. And a lot of you that you browse websites, you actually have cached content on your system. So, but this is not the browser cache that some of you know, that when you are, after you access a website for the first time, then the next time you are accessing the website, majority of what you are interacting with, they are actually on your system, not coming from the customer, because it has already been cached on your system, so that the latencies can be slow or slower. So this is the content of edge location. So companies also tend to use this edge location to serve or distribute their content. So anytime they are dealing with a question that is talking about content delivery network, this is what it's talking about, edge location. So you use edge location to deliver content. So in edge location, there are not a lot of services like availability zone or local zone. In edge location, you might just have what is enough to deliver your content, which is just a server, and possibly majorly a server or some firewall that will be monitoring who is connecting or not. But all other services, so let's say the other time we say in an availability zone there is 100 services. In a local zone there might be 50. In edge location there might just be four services. So that services is just enough to serve your content closer to the people. So this is the concept of edge location, and this actually come out a lot in interview because a lot of companies normally use CloudFront. It's a very good service. Even AWS advise that or recommend that if you have a website or web application that you are serving to people, instead of serving it directly from the server, from the original server, you want to serve it from either CloudFront. You put CloudFront in front of the web, so the customer has to talk to CloudFront, then the CloudFront will pull the information from the original server, or you put a load balancer. So if you are doing interview, this is one way you can tell your employer that you help your company to enhance their website. Initially, most companies might have their website directly. They just change the website IP address to a friendly name called domain name, like uzik.com. So they change this IP address to this domain name, and they give their customer the domain name uzik.com. So the customer, anytime they want to access their website, they will type uzik and it will direct them here. So instead of going this route, AWS and its best practice to actually put the website in front, to put a CloudFront or a load balancer in front of the website. So the purpose for this is that you can use WAF, what is called Web Application Firewall, to monitor this application, who is connecting to the application. You can use Web Application Firewall to monitor their traffic, whether it is allowed or denied. We are going to see Web Application Firewall when we get to security. All right, let's go on 5 minutes break. I've already explained the edge location, which is used as node or server for a global content delivery. It reduces traffic to the original server because people are not talking to original server again. They are talking to the cached node. It's located in different locations around the world and allow AWS and its customer to serve content from locations that are closer to their customer. So now we are done with these basic theoretical parts, which is the introductions to the AWS and AWS global infrastructure. Our next topic now is dealing with our AWS account. So when we come back from the 5-minute break, then that's when we are going to be logging into our AWS account and set up our environment for the days ahead. The days ahead are complex, tough than what we have passed through. So let's go on 5-minute break. When we come back, we start with our AWS account. I'm going to stop the video. So we're going to have 2 videos. Make sure you always watch the video. I always store it with like today is day 4. I'm going to say day 4.1 and day 4.2. Make sure you watch both for today's video.